Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Grief to Growth podcast. I'm your host, Brian, and I'm truly delighted to have you here today. Today, we have a very special guest. His name is Edward Grinnan. He's the editor-in-chief of Guideposts Publication and is the author of the deeply moving memoir, A Journey of Faith, A Mother's Alzheimer's, A Son's Love, and His Search for Answers. Before we get into our conversation with Edward, let me briefly introduce myself to you in case you don't know who I am. Again, I'm Brian, and I'm here to provide a safe and compassionate space for people that are navigating the journey of grief. My own experience with loss started with my daughter passing away 8 years ago at the age of 15. Her name is Shayna, and that's led me on this path of discovery and understanding about the nature of life and death and all the things that we have to go through. So let's get back to Edward. Edward's is Edward Grinnan again. His latest book, he shares a deeply personal journey through his mother's illness and his unwavering love and support for her during her Alzheimer's journey. It's a touching tribute to his mother, exploring the bond of family and faith, and his testament to the enduring power of love. His impressive career spans over 2 decades at Guideposts Publications, where he currently holds the position of editor-in-chief and vice president. He's not only a seasoned professional, but he's also a gifted author with several inspirational books to his name. And his upcoming release is A Journey of Faith, and it promises to be a moving and enlightening read. So with that, I want to thank Edward for being here today and welcome you to Grief to Growth.
Thank you, Brian, and greetings to your audience. And I hope I live up to that very nice introduction you gave me.
Oh, I'm absolutely sure that you will. I want to, again, thank you for being here. I want to tell everybody before we get started, we have a little bit of delay with the satellite. Edward lives in a very beautiful area. So it's the satellite reception is a little bit, so there might be a little delay, but we'll get through this and we'll try not to just talk over each other. Edward, I'd like for you, if you could start by, I'm sure most of our audience is familiar with Guidepost magazine. I know millions of people read it, but for those who are not familiar with Guidepost, please tell us a little bit about the magazine and how you got started there.
Well, it was founded in 1945 by Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, and some of you may recognize that name. He wrote The Power of Positive Thinking, which is one of the seminal books of the 20th century for, sort of linking self-empowerment with faith in God. Sort of if you believe in yourself and you believe in God, then you can do great things for yourself. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Peale actually founded Guidepost magazine about 8 years before he wrote The Power of Positive Thinking. I think a lot of his thinking was shaped by the experiences that he discovered in interviewing people for Guidepost magazine. Guidepost magazine was the original sort of user-generated content at a time when magazines tended to be a little bit up in the, the audience was out there in the proscenium, beyond the proscenium stage, and you spoke to them. And Dr. Peale had the idea that everyday people from all walks of life, different faiths, incredibly diverse gathering of people could tell their personal stories of faith in action and in their everyday lives. Not big conversion stories, but much smaller stories sometimes about how people overcame problems and found solutions by belief in themselves and belief in God. And that's the story of Guidepost magazine. It grew throughout the years and it reaches millions of people every issue. Mm-hmm. It has celebrity sometimes, but it has mostly everyday, ordinary people sharing their struggles, their strengths, their hope, and their triumphs.
It's an awesome magazine. I know it inspires a lot of people. And I know Norman Vincent Peale was known for the power of positive thinking. Now, your memoir covers a disease, though, that we know of, Alzheimer's, that people don't recover from. So tell me how this played out as you were going through this experience with your mother going through Alzheimer's.
Well, Alzheimer's, I know sort of the subject of the topic of your podcast is grief. And, in most cases, people die relatively suddenly in our lives. We lose them. Maybe it's expected. In Alzheimer's, it's kind of a journey of grief. For me, it was also a journey of faith, but you lose that person a little bit every day, every week, every month as you see them begin to sort of fade away. This Alzheimer's that afflicted my mother seems to run in our family. on the maternal side of the family. She had three sisters and three brothers. All three girls, all three daughters died in memory care. And one of the three brothers also had Alzheimer's or dementia. The other two brothers probably died too soon before they could have shown symptoms. And all of that seems to come from their father, my grandfather, who was the only grandparent I knew. When he was way back in the 50s, when I was a little kid and he was afflicted with dementia, they didn't have a name for it really. I mean, they just said, oh, he's doty, he's senile, he's just, old. And whenever I visited him, the thing he would do is he'd bestow a quarter on me, so I was and then as the time passed, he'd sometimes forget that he gave me a quarter and he'd give me another one. And, I'd go over there and he'd say, did I give you your quarter? And of course, as the kid that I was, I said, oh, of course not. You didn't give me a quarter. So I was loading up on quarters by the end, but I just thought it was a game that he was playing with me. I didn't realize the effect of that one little interpersonal exchange I had with him when I was just a little boy would sort of color the way I looked at life later on, and particularly when my mother got sick. The very first signs, and the very first signs really came from her church. She was a really smart woman. I mean, she was the daughter of a school teacher. She learned how to read before she even went to first grade. She was one of these people who had two books going at any given time. Plus, she did the New York Times crossword puzzle in ink. She was a quiz show champion in the 1950s. She was really a smart woman, and she did a lot of charity work, and she was devoted to her church. And one of the things she did, it was a Catholic church, St. Owen's in Birmingham, Michigan, and she would count the collection basket after daily mass, and her job was to count it up and fill out a deposit slip and take it to the bank. Saved a lot of trouble so that the pastor didn't have to do that. And one of the nuns, Sister Carolyn, called us at one point and said, your mother is slipping up. The deposit slips don't add up to the amount of money that she's taking to the bank, and it's causing some confusion. But I'll double check her for you, because we don't want her to, she's very proud and she wants to be of use to her church and to her faith. So we're going to let her keep doing it. But I'm going to double check and go to the bank with her every day and make sure that deposit slip is correct, so we don't have any misunderstandings at the bank. And she was also the church librarian. And again, around that same time, Sister Carol called us up and said, your mother's having trouble reshelving the books. The Dewey Decimal System is beginning to confuse her. And we're going to take her off of that. She can still check books in and out at the front desk. So, it was like almost like a strike of fear through me when I started knowing my family history, and we started to hearing those things about my mother. And I began thinking, there's no stopping this, and it will go on until it's over. And that was just, almost immediately I felt myself grieving for what I knew would be an inevitable loss. And but death is one thing, because death is a full stop as far as life on earth goes. But dealing with someone with a dementia like Alzheimer's or any of the related ones, you see them die a little bit. You lose that person day by day by day. They know it's a disaggregation of your cognitive abilities. The mind begins to fly apart in slow motion. And to see it was incredibly painful. But into the journey, I also found these moments of hope and beauty that were completely unexpected, which I think sometimes happens even when we are deep into grief, where we have these bursts of beauty in our memories of our loved one. In my mother's case, I found that as all of these things faded away, when I wasn't even sure she knew who I was, though she did, I know that now. The two things that seemed to survive the ravages of Alzheimer's were love and faith. And
Mm.
for some reason, they seem to survive even the onslaught of cognitive decline. And in the end, that was my mother, love and faith. And those two things are what gave me such hope at the end. The last word my mother ever said to me, and she hadn't spoken for a while. And I was telling, I knew she was going to die soon. And I was telling her, I was apologizing, for what a bad son I thought I had been. And I had been at times, very bad. So we can talk about that. And the only thing she said, it was the last thing she said to me, was love. That one word.
Mm.
Excuse me.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful to hear that survived, even as you said, the onslaught of the disease. I know with Alzheimer's, as I was telling you, I think before we start recording, I've gone through it. What I've gone through with my father-in-law, and we're going through it now with my mother-in-law. And there's that anticipatory grief that we don't have with a lot of other things, and there's that losing the person. It's one thing to lose the body, but to lose that mind and that connection, I think a special kind of grief that we go through, as we see our loved one no longer who they were. So as you're going through that, and being that you're the editor of Guidepost magazine, how was that? How did your faith help you to cope with that, and this positive outlook? How did you maintain that?
Um, it wasn't always positive, I'll tell you that. You know, to see someone's memories, we are made of memories. I mean, that's really who we are. Everything we are is a function of our memory system. It's how cognition functions. So to see those memories slip away like that, like watching a sailboat disappear slowly into a fog bank, is very difficult. And it was very difficult. I should tell you a little bit. You asked me how I came to Guidepost magazine.
Mhm.
So when I came to Guidepost, I had never heard of. People are always shocked by the fact that I had no idea what Guidepost was. I thought it was a travel magazine. I think it sounds like a travel magazine. Maybe I can get a few trips out of this job. Um, if you substitute journey for travel, then that's what it's been for me. And I came to Guideposts, and I was in a very bad state. I was, pretty much a bottomed out alcoholic. I had lost just about everything, you know, the most important relationships of my life. Everything was gone. I was hanging on by a thread, and for a little time, a little bit before I'd been in and out of, I slept in the streets. There was a time when I begged for change so I could keep drinking. I would pick up cigarette butts and smoke them, so I couldn't afford cigarettes. So anyway, I don't know how Guidepost got my resume. I was trying to get back on my feet at the time. I have no idea, but this recruiter called me and said, "Would you be interested in going to an interview at Guidepost magazine?" I said, "First of all, who are you?" I've never heard of you, and I don't know how you got my phone number. And secondly, what's Guideposts? And she said, "Well, your writing background may be of interest to them." So I was desperate and penniless, and about to lose my apartment or get kicked out of my apartment. And so I went in for the interview, and it was almost like I all of a sudden knew where I was for the first time in many years, that I was in the right place. And I said to myself, "Well, I'll stick around for a year." I've been going to 12-step meetings at the time, and my sponsor said, "Just find a job, any job, hang on to it for a year while you work on your sobriety and you work on your spirituality and your relationship to a higher power, whether you believe in him or not, act as if, and
Mm.
just do." So, okay, so Guideposts look like a nice place to spend a year, and that was in 1986. And, I got sober at Guideposts. And what kept me there was the beauty of the audience and their stories and what they went through in their lives, and big emotions sometimes, loss and grief, depression, people overcoming these things. And they almost like carried me during a time when I needed to be carried. the audience did. So I tell you this background because when my mother, some years later, when my mother began to suffer the symptoms of dementia, and she was in Michigan with my brother and my sister-in-law, but I was in New York City, Manhattan, working at Guideposts, and I was panic-stricken that I couldn't be there for my mother. There's no reason to think that she would never have wanted me to come back to Michigan to take care of her. That would have horrified her because she was so independent. But in the beginning part of that time, and I think has to do with that anticipatory grief, that fear of losing her and knowing that it was going to be painful, I did start drinking again. And, and it took me back, not necessarily to the depths that I had been at when I first came to Guideposts, but emotionally and spiritually, the depths were the same. Maybe not the outside, the loss of apartments and not having a place to live and having no money. That wasn't it. But spiritually, I lost my contact with God, and I began drinking and drugging again for on and off for a couple of years until I ended up in a detox. And I was really forced to confront the fact that I was trying to smother these feelings I was having about my mother. I tried to tell myself I was an alcoholic and I drank because I drank. That's what alcoholics do. And I saw a therapist in this facility, and he said, "Let's talk about your mother." And I said, "No, let's not talk about what she's going through. It has nothing to do with what I'm going through." And he said, "Well, maybe it does. Maybe it does. It's not an excuse for drinking and drugging, but it is a trigger." And that really began my journey towards hope and faith with my mother's illness, where I really began to accept that it was going to be painful and that I would go through that. And then, I realized at that time, and you hate to say this about something as painful as grief and loss, but in my life, the only time I've really had significant spiritual and emotional growth is during the difficult times, during the struggles. When I'm happy and everything's fine and I just feel wonderful, that's great, but I don't experience a lot of spiritual growth and personal, progress in those moments. I've always found it's in the moments and the struggles and the pain, which are just part of life and you can't get by them. It's a place where you learn so much about yourself. And what I learned in my mother's illness and the prospect of losing her was that I could survive. I could survive that.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And that's been my experience too, is that I think it's the human design that when we're going through what we call good times, when things are fine, we don't experience that growth. It's when we're tested, when we're tried, when we're put through that trial by fire, that we realize how strong we are. And in fact, I believe we become even stronger. I don't think that the pain of this world is a mistake. I don't think it's a bug. I think it's a feature. I think it's something that, and I'm sure being the editor-in-chief of Guideposts for all those years, when people are writing their stories of triumph, they're overcoming something, right? I mean, those are the stories that you're publishing.
They're always, these are stories of overcoming. And it's fascinating to see that can be overcoming something as small as learning to fit in at a new job, and maybe facing your insecurities about that. Or it could be facing the loss of a child or facing the loss of a spouse or a job, and overcoming that. But the interesting thing was if it's someone just trying to fit in at a new job and getting comfortable in their cubicle, or if it's someone trying to face a life crisis, the tools are the same. The tools are pushing down denial and letting go and just believing that there's a path for you to go forward. So many times, I've had guidepost stories and in life in general, we think there's no way forward. When we're trapped in those moments where life is really testing us. I like that word you use, testing, and we think there's no path forward. We find that path. And that path is an inspiration to others. And I think one of the most important things about guidepost stories is the people who tell them want to help other people. It's not just here's what happened to me. And the Guidepost audience, when we talk to them, we talk to them a lot, always say, oh boy, I can identify. I can identify with what that person went through. Maybe I never went through anything like it, but I've gone through things that remind me of that struggle. And I can understand that there's light on the other side of that of that of that struggle.
You mentioned something that I think is very important, that feeling that there's no path forward. When we go through the worst types of grief, I think that's the one thing we have in common. We feel like this is the one I'm not going to be able to survive. This is the one I'm not going to be able to overcome. And we feel like is the end of the road. And I'm wondering, did it feel like that for you when your mother got this diagnosis?
Later, it sometimes felt like I was falling. It felt like I was just falling through space, and I didn't know where I would land, if I would survive the landing. And it was my mother's strength that persisted throughout her disease. And the people who have in your audience who have dealt with an Alzheimer's or dementia patient, and I know there are many of them because it affects millions and millions of families in this country, know that there is always a core of someone inside that person who seems so lost to us. When I found the most important thing with my mother was to be present, to live in the present. That this disease told me that I had to meet my mother in the present because that's all she had. She had the moment, the pinhole in time that she lived in, because the past was being wiped out for her and she had no concept of the future. So I had to find how to meet her in that moment. And sometimes it was just being with her. Sometimes in the middle, our tendencies when our loved ones begin to talk in a way that we think is irrational or unrealistic. Like my mother would say that she had a conversation with someone that morning, and I'd say, "Oh, who?" And it would be someone who's been dead for years.
Yeah.
My tendency as a son is to say, "No, no, you didn't talk to that person. That person, don't you realize it? Don't you remember they died 15 years ago?" And I realized that was the wrong thing to say. Totally. The right thing to say, what took me a while to learn was, oh, well, how was that conversation? What did it just talk about? And, in that moment, I was able to meet her where she was instead of trying to drag her back to where I was, which was, someone without dementia. And I realized as we went through this process, this this slow process of grief as I lost her, and I lost her every day or every week or every month, a little bit more, that, if I stayed in the present, if I was there just with her, that sense of grief would lift because I couldn't love my mother if I was grieving her while she was still alive. Because grief will block out that. We think, I'm going to say something that I've said before and written about, and people sometimes don't agree, but grief can be a very selfish thing, because it's so self-centered, and it is a universal feeling that goes back. I mean, you can find cave paintings and ancient hieroglyphs describing grief. It's very fundamental to the human condition.
Sure.
And even other, higher order of mammals seem to suffer, the period of grief. It's important to us to know that people matter to us so much that we will suffer and when they die, when they leave us, when they go on. But grief can also be a blocker, and if I wanted to be there for my mother as she was dying, um, I had to push through that grief, that sense of, oh, I've lost my mom, and just say, no, she's still here. And there's a way to reach out, and sometimes that's just holding a hand, sometimes just sitting there. During the last of my mother's time, I spent a lot of time just sitting with her, and we didn't have to say anything. I just knew my presence meant something, and it's certainly her presence meant something to me. But it was all about being in the moment. So when I say grief is selfish, for me, sometimes it has been because so much about me. I mean, that's grief. It's your feelings, your emotions
Hmm.
that you're experiencing. And I remind myself to be cautious about that. That it is a process, and one that we have to push ourselves through, and sometimes we get stuck.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that was very, very well said, and I understand what you're saying. You know, I tell people I think there are two sides to grief. We grieve for ourselves what we're losing, and we supposedly grieve for what our loved one has lost, especially when in the case of death, when someone transitions to the next world. And I tell people, don't grieve for them because they're okay. The people that are making that transition to the next world, they're fine. And I was just this happens to be, I guess, dementia day, because I interviewed someone earlier this morning who lost her mother to another form of dementia, and we were talking about one of the lessons that we get from this is being in the moment, and that's all we have with people with these diseases, with Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia. They don't have the past. We can't go back to that, but we can learn to be in the moment, which is something that we could all use in our lives. So they're here. I think
Yes,
it teaches us something.
sure. It teaches us the power of the present, um, which is so important. And I live in New York City. I live down the street from the New York headquarters of the Franciscans. They have a beautiful church, the Church of St. Francis. And I would walk my dogs by them for a long time, for many years. And I loved the friars. They'd come out and bless my dogs, you know. And it's always so wonderful to bring your dog for a blessing. Um, but I would talk to them about my mother, and especially after she died. And this one friar said to me, "Look, she's in a better place. Think of the suffering that has ended. Think of how, she was a woman of tremendous faith, and she's moved on to something that is more wonderful than you can possibly imagine. So, if you're grieving, grieve for yourself, surely, but don't grieve for her because she's gone to something better, and you need to acknowledge that and let go, because you can't keep her here. And in your grief, you're sort of trapping your mother, not in any, ghost-like way, but you're
Right.
sort of emotionally trapping your mother here when
Hmm.
she's gone on. I know the pain that you're in, but you have to at least celebrate that she's with God. She's in a better place where she needs to be. And, that helped me a lot. That
Hmm.
kept me from slipping over the edge all the time and just sort of sitting down and saying, don't know what to do with myself.
Yeah, I think
Um,
it's both things at once. The grief is a normal process that we have to go through. It is it's that love that honors that person, and it says how important that person to us, and that perceived loss that we feel like we've lost them. So we can't, I don't think we can bypass that. I don't think it's part of being human, but we can always hold on to this idea also, at the same time, that they're better off. They're out of the pain. Their memories are back intact. And I believe, and I'd like to ask your thoughts on this. You were saying your mother would talk about talking to deceased people. How do you feel about when people are going through this and they're starting to say, so and so came to visit me yesterday? Time for a real quick break. Make sure you like and subscribe. Liking the video will show it to more people on YouTube, and subscribing will make sure you get access to all my great content in the future. And now back to the video.
and you mean in a dementia patient having
Yes.
those sort of hallucinatory experiences? They are wandering through the maze of their minds. And if you ever look at a brain, you can see all the channels and squiggles. And if I used to picture that my mother was wandering through that maze, trying to find her past and find herself,
Hmm.
and it wasn't incorrect. You tend, particularly when that relationship between parent and child is suddenly flipped, you know, on its head, like the polarity of it completely changes, and suddenly you're in charge of them and you're telling them. It's so hard, the would I learned to resist, and so did my siblings and other people who loved my mother, was to go with that. If they're having conversations with people that don't exist, That's fine. They're in their heads trying to work it out, and they're trying to find something and learn something, and it is however nonsensical it may seem to us that they're having that conversation and they're talking nonsense to us.
Hmm.
There's a process that they're trying to figure something out, and they're losing the capacity to figure these things out, but they're trying. And the best thing I could do was be there for my mother and let her know that it was all okay. My mother, thank God, was never violent. She did not go through that period that some Alzheimer's and dementia patients go through, where they're really agitated and angry,
They
and that's
do.
just them. They're just fighting the disease. That's all they're doing, and you've got to give them that. But fortunately, my mother never went through that period. But she went through a period where she was very difficult, and it was so sad for me to see her fight so hard about a disease that she knew was in her family. Even though there's a lot of denial in the beginning when she began to lose her memories and her
Sure.
cognition deteriorated. So to see her fight that hard was heartbreaking, but it was also something I I had to learn to tell her not to stop doing. Just like it's a process, it's a journey, and that journey has bumps in the road for them, and you've got to go with them. It is an incredible test of empathy and compassion because particularly as a child, you want things to be okay. I mean, this is your mother. You came from her, and
Yeah.
you desperately want them not to have this disease, and not, you know, it, it's so difficult because it's about cognition, it's about the brain, it's the mind, it's a brain disease. It's not insanity, it's not mental illness, it's a organic brain disease. And it takes them away from you. I hated that word Alzheimer's. I hated it. I didn't, and I hated what it was doing, and I had to stop hating. I had to just, I learned how to be empathetic and compassionate to a degree that I never expected myself to be able to achieve. And it was by force. It wasn't because I'm a particularly good person, because I'm not. It was because I had to use it. I needed empathy to survive
Hmm.
what was my mother was going through and what would happen after she died.
Yeah. I think that tests like that, it, I think it's both things. We have a strength in us that we don't know that we have, and I think these tests bring it out of us. I think it also helps us to grow. I think we get stronger as we go through these trials. So I hear you talking about your mother and the Alzheimer's and how much you hate it, but I also see, how you've developed, through it. And you said you even went back and started drinking again, and then you overcame that again. And I think every time we do that, we expand our capacity. We grow as a soul.
I think so too, and it seems sometimes it seems unfair that we have to go through the tough times to get to the good times. But that's the way the world is made, and you have to understand that that's where you live, and you can't change that. Um, oh, it's just it's a journey, and one of the reasons why I wrote the book, A Journey of Faith, was to give people hope. I mean, what people always said say about Guidepost magazine is that they can read it every day and they get hope. They can read it first thing, they can read it in line at the supermarket, and by the time they get checked out, their their demons, their depression, their anxiety is lifted by listening to other people tell stories about how they overcame things.
Hmm.
And I wanted this book to be that. I wanted it to tell people that, in any situations that you're in, whether it's the loss of a loved one or just the loss of self, um, that you can get through it. There's hope and beauty. And I wanted to inspire people who are going through difficult times, that the difficult times don't last forever. And they're something that you learn and you go through and you get out the other side, and it's better. It gets better. It's one of the things I said today. When I went to a 12-step program, I first started stop drinking. I was a mess. And the old timers would come up and they'd say, "Hey, it gets better." And that's all they said to me. But they were right. It does get better. Grief gets better, and it's painful. I think grief makes you stronger when you wrestle with it and then get past it. It's grief is like this, visage on your path that's sort of blocking your way to go forward, and you have to wrestle with it
Mm-hmm.
and then get through it. And one of the things for me that at first was painful in grief, but has helped me a lot, is just remembering good things about the person, how
Yeah.
wonderful a life they led, how much they brought into the world with them, and left when they left the world. They, their whole life was a blessing to themselves and to others, and particularly the people you love.
Mm-hmm.
So those sorts of celebratory, reminders, like, I still laugh at things. I would see things on television and my mother would make a remark about all these years later, and I'll sit there and laugh like, that's what she would have said about this guy. She would have liked him. So it's, and it really is about grief is a form of love, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And with all the positives and negatives of love, because love can make us crazy. But grief is a form of love because you grieve the loss of someone you love. In the end, I think really who we are is basically who we love.
Mm-hmm.
So loss is wrenching. But it's grief is the price we pay for love.
Yeah.
And the more you love that person, probably the harder you're going to grieve. And the grief is the last part of that love.
Yeah, I think I agree with that 100%. Grief is the price that we pay for love. Uh, there's, love is a risk. Whenever we love anybody, anything, it's a risk because it can be taken away. That's part of what makes it so precious. And then we have to decide, is it worth me going through this? Is it, but I think ultimately most of us decide it's worth taking that risk, even knowing that, none of us lives forever. At some point we're going to part with that loved one, but we
Right.
do it anyway.
Right. I mean, life would have no meaning without death. So it's not something we can turn off. And when we talk about love, love isn't always a choice. Sometimes it is, but when it comes to your parents, it's not a choice. You're born loving them,
Right.
no matter what happens.
Right.
And a lot of things going to happen in your relationship with your parents, but you are born loving those two people, and so that's going to be part of your growth and your grief throughout from the beginning to the end of your life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and missing someone is not the same as grieving them either. I think it's okay to miss people who have gone on. Of course, you
Right.
miss people who go on a world trip. Why
Right.
not miss people who have died? But missing them is something different, I think, than grieving. And, grieving them is a real deep sense of loss.
Yes. Yes. I often say to people, it's like we don't grieve someone when they go on a trip. When your daughter goes away to college, like my daughter went away to college, and I was upset. I was sad. I missed her, but I didn't grieve her. And I think the difference is, and this is where we can start to mitigate the grief, is when we understand they haven't really gone away. We are going to see them again, and shifting that perspective, I think it can help to mitigate the grief and turn it into more of a missing them, a more of a, and then like you said earlier, when it comes to the memories when someone first crosses over can be actually painful, and people will want to put the memories away and not remember. And sometimes people even, I don't want to see my loved one's picture because it's going to trigger me. It's going to cause me to go through the whole grieving process again. But when I see my daughter's picture now, I smile. I love the memories of the time I had with her, and that's that transition
Right.
we can make.
Right. I do. I keep a picture of my mother in my home office. Just, so it's like, okay, she lived, she died, she loved you, and it was really good. And just
Mhm.
don't be afraid of that picture. And I remember, when the moment she died, and I was not there. I had been there the last couple of weeks, but I had to leave. and my brother and my sister were away. I gave them kind of some relief time and spent time with my mother. And
Hmm.
just spent and took off from work and just spent time with her. But then I had to go, and she waited until they came back, you know, to die. Um, but I was teaching a writer's workshop in Arizona, and that morning before the day began, that morning I decided I wanted to go for a hike. I wanted to hike up a mountain. So I found this mountain outside. I forget where it was, but southern Arizona. And I got to the top of the mountain. I just felt overcome. Just overcome. I was breathless from the climb. And I lay down and just looked at the sun. And I felt this incredible feeling. It was like a swooning of the soul, like something was being lifted, a whooshing. It was physical. It was a physical thing. And then I had to get back to where we were meeting, and I climbed back down the hillside and the path. And I went back into our hotel, and there was a message for me. And I
Mm.
knew what that message was.
Yeah.
I knew that my mother had died. And when I looked into it, it was at the exact same moment that I was on top of that mountain. I felt
Yeah.
like she passed on the way up.
Yeah, exactly. That's beautiful. Yeah, that's beautiful that you had that experience and were able to have that connection and feel her. I think sometimes people do. They stop by on the way out and they say goodbye, to the
They
loved
do.
ones. Yeah.
I In Guidepost magazine and some of our other, we have Guidepost magazine. We also have Angels on Earth magazine, which is about people's encounters with angelic forces, not just angelic beings, but and we have a magazine called Mysterious Ways. And there's so many stories in those magazines about people who have had some sort of, you know, relationship, experience, with a loved one who's gone on or who is passing. I mean, it's almost common, and people shouldn't be frightened or ashamed of it, because I know people are sometimes scared to even talk about some of the things surrounding the death of a loved one. But there's all sorts of miracles that we are given, to help us.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I know before we started recording, you shared with me you've experienced another big loss in your life, recently. So I don't know how much you want to share about that, because I know that's again, this we go through these journeys, and I think sometimes we feel like the trials never stop coming, and frankly, I don't think they really do. But so do you want to share about that?
I will talk about that a little bit, because of the book, The Journey of Faith, is about my mother's passing 20 years ago and how
Hmm.
I processed since. I lost my wife, Julie, a year ago in last January, June of 2022. And I lost her to suicide. And, it was a shock, but to some extent it wasn't, because Julie talked about it. She had she had a disease, lupus, that had really crippled her and really diminished her life, and she had depression, and frankly there was suicide in her family, and often there's a family history of suicide.
Hmm.
And that's something I'm still processing. Like, Julie was a singer, a recording artist, and I heard a song of hers come on. I still can't listen to them. I've got, I don't know, 2,000 songs on my iPhone probably, but
Hmm.
I still will skip when I hear Julie. And it's not that I don't know why I do it, but because, like, I haven't quite processed it. And part of what made Julie beautiful was her recording career and
Sure.
her performances, and so that's so much what I loved about her when I first met her. Um, but when someone takes their life, when you love someone and they take their life, it's really, you know, it's hard not to blame yourself. It's really hard not to be angry at them, even though even though in Julie's case, looking back, I think she prepared me for it. But it's such a sudden and, conscious. I mean, we rarely decide to die. Few people decide to die,
Right.
and that's what suicide is. It's a decision to end your life. And you can't get inside that decision of another person except to say, you have to accept it. I mean, more than even my mother's death, the challenge to accept that Julie made this decision. And I know that spiritually she was at peace with it. I don't think it was done in a moment of crazy despair. I think thinking back, she had planned it and just decided her suffering physically and emotionally was so great
Mm-hmm.
that the only way to end the pain was to end her life. And I always want to turn the clock back. Could I have stopped it? Could I have talked her out of it? And that's all about not accepting, you know, and it's
Mm-hmm.
the hardest thing I've ever had to accept in my life. And I'm still trying to accept it. I'm still trying to say that, not that it's okay, I'm not there yet, but that somehow there are things that I don't understand and that happened that I have to learn to accept that they happened. That this was part of my life, was to have, Julie and I were married for 34 years,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and and the fact that it's suicide, there's a shame around suicide.
Yes.
The morning after, you know, I and I don't know how the word got out, but the obituary writer for the New York Times called me the next morning, and he had read about it, I don't somewhere online, Rolling Stone or The Guardian, I think, had reported Julie's death a little earlier. And he said, that they'd like to do an obituary on Julie. And, you know, can you give us, there's a lot of information about her online, but can you tell us, a little bit about her life and it had not been said in any of the previous reportings of Julie's death that she had taken her life.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept thinking, should I tell this guy, this obituary, writer from the, New York Times, that my wife actually took her own life? I think most of the stuff online had been that she had died of lupus, which was sort of true. Um, and I finally told him, I said, she took her own life. That's how she actually died. It wasn't actually, lupus. So that was like in the midst of killing her, because her kidneys had begun to fail, and she had not been able to walk very easily. And he said, well, we don't have to say that. We don't, it's up to you. And, I thought about it. And I know that, Julie's brother had committed suicide almost exactly 10 years before she did. And, he died kind of in this anonymous way. And it always bothered Julie that no one ever talked about the fact that Mickey took his life, and that she thought that was, that that was shaming Mickey for
Mm-hmm.
doing that. It was bringing shame. And so I said, no, I want to say how she died, because I know there are other families out there and other people like me who are struggling with this and feeling guilty and feeling angry and feeling judgmental and all this swirl, this cyclone of emotions that you have to go through. And, it's not something that should be hidden any more than Alzheimer's. I mean, it's how she died, and there are families who need to know that you can talk about it. You can talk about it. You can say the word suicide. It's not, it's such a powerful and negative word, because it's such a form of death that we don't accept. We just don't want to accept it. And it is about acceptance. So so for the past year and a half, I've been struggling through it. It's been up and down.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as I said, I don't know if I'll ever be able to listen to her music again, which is odd, because people thought, some of my friends say, well, that's what I do. I listen to all her music, but it's really hard.
No,
Um,
I understand that. And I thank you, first of all, so much for being vulnerable and sharing that, because I think it helps to lift the stigma around suicide, which I think is totally unwarranted. We need to try to understand people's motivations for doing things they do, and if we can't understand it, we have to accept it, because it is what it is. And you being so early in your grief, and I would say this is early in grief, 34-year marriage, and it's only been a year and a half. That's early. So you're still in that shock mode, and it's still I remember when my daughter passed away, we used to like to go to White Castle. It's a hamburger place in the Midwest.
Oh yeah,
So
I love white stuff.
I would take my daughter to White Castle, and my wife didn't like the hamburger, so it was something that Shane and I did was special to us. And I remember the first time I was coming back from a grief council, and I drove by the White Castle, and I just started crying. And then I almost thought about avoiding. I don't want to drive by it anymore, but it's 5 minutes from my house, so I'd have to go way out of my way not to drive by that place. But now I drive by the White Castle and I smile. I remember the first time I took her there, and it's a happy memory. And I think it's the same way with Julie's music. I believe that one day when you're ready, you'll put it back on, and it'll trigger those good memories. But right now, I think it's just too early.
Yeah, that's what people tell me, because I'm not smart enough to figure it out for myself. But people say, hey, it's a process. You've written about it being a process, and now you're in the process. So, take your own medicine. Understand that this isn't going away tomorrow.
Yeah,
This is not going away. It goes away when it goes away.
yeah,
That grief, that sort of bursting through or wrestling that visage that's blocking our path. It's a process, and everyone says it's a process, but it is. I mean, it's true. And, you know, um, my last book was always called Always by My Side. It was about all the dogs in my life.
mm,
And Julie and I didn't have kids, we had dogs. And so necessarily as I gone through all the dogs, they all first die in the book. They have to, because and that's part of the heartache of being a dog owner, is you outlive all but the last one.
right.
No one grieved the death of a dog more than Julie. I mean, Julie loved animals more than she loved people. She said it openly, and she was not ashamed of saying that, you know. And she used to grieve the loss of our dog so hard. And part of me wanted to say, "Would you stop it? You're gonna have another dog. We'll have more joy." But then, so what I'm learning now is how wrong that was, and how I can learn from how Julie grieved her mother's death, and particularly the death of some of our dearest, most lovable dogs, and
Hmm.
watched her go through that. And it's almost like there's a path there for me. I mean,
Hmm.
Julie did it. She learned, and she let herself go completely. She surrendered to grief until she got through it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I'm that strong, but it's what I'm trying to do.
The words surrender and acceptance keep coming up in our conversation, and
Yeah.
I think that's a really powerful lesson that we're here to learn. And sometimes, so the word surrender gets a bad rap because it's like we're giving up, and it's not that at all. it's really
No,
it's really more acceptance.
it really is. And you make an incredibly important point. There's a huge gulf between the word surrender and giving up.
Hmm.
Because surrender is a type of freedom that you achieve when you can surrender. Forgiveness, and part of grief is forgiving the people who died, because we think, how could they leave us? You
Hmm.
have to, and forgiveness is one of the greatest forms of surrender, because you have to let go of that forgiveness. I felt that way about my mother to some extent. Like, how could you, how could you die? You're my mother. You know,
Yeah.
um, it's
Yeah.
an absurd thought, but some of us can be very angry at the people who've gone on and who've died.
Absolutely.
And certainly with Julie, I had those moments of anger, like, why did you do this? Why did you change our life like this? But I also know that Julie was suffering. You know,
Hmm.
I knew how much she was suffering. I knew it. And not only that, but she was probably suffering more than I knew. And I
Probably
knew
is.
she was suffering. And she was in a lot of pain. And she was sick of taking prescription pain medication. She didn't like the way it felt. There were many things about her life that were really intolerable to her. And just because they might be tolerable to me, I wasn't going through that. So that sense of being angry and judgmental, it doesn't go away just because I understand it, but at least I recognize it. And in that recognition, at some point, that recognition leads to surrender and acceptance.
Yeah, and that's the beginning of it. That's the beginning of it. And as we were saying, it is a process. As much as we might understand it intellectually, none of us can bypass it. We have to go through. We have to go through it. We have to process it, and it's deeply individual. And we have these irrational thoughts. We have anger at the person who left us, whether it's by Alzheimer's or it's by suicide. We have guilt. Should I have picked up on this? What if I had done something different? Could I have stopped it? And it's never our fault, but we have to go through that as humans. We have to wrestle with that.
Yeah, I'm, that, and that's where I am, with Julie's death is, there was nothing I could do to stop Alzheimer's.
Right.
But in a way, I have to think that way about Julie too. There was nothing I could ultimately could do
Right.
because it was a decision. It was a decision, and she didn't do it to hurt me. It wasn't punitive.
Mhm.
It was, I can't go on like this. And Julie would probably say, neither can you go on seeing me like this.
Mhm.
Um, anyway, it is it is something that I'm just trying on a daily basis. I still miss her. I still think about her.
Sure.
And I think about the way she died, and I feel guilt and shame. But those are selfish emotions, guilt and shame. And we rationalize and understand things intellectually. Human beings have these big brains, we have intellects. We've had emotions a lot longer than we've had intellect. We
Right.
are emotional beings. We tell ourselves we're thinking, and we do think a lot about a lot of different things. But deep inside, we are profoundly emotional people.
Right.
And those emotions are what really determine who we are and how we navigate life and
Right.
how we navigate loss. It's not an intellectual process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think yeah, that's a lesson that I'm learning at this point in my life because I'm an engineer, I'm a very rational person. And I've always tried to think my way through everything. And I'm realizing no, it's all about how you feel. Everything's about how we feel about things. That's the ultimate truth is how we feel about things. And we use the intellect to rationalize our emotions, but the emotions are
Yes.
what they are.
Yeah. My intellect is here to try to explain my emotions to me. That's really what its chief function is. And also with other people too. But we are driven by our emotions, by our spirits. We're driven by love. I'm glad love is not a rational thing. Love is by definition irrational.
Mhm.
And, if it were rational, it would not be as powerful. And if we didn't love, we wouldn't grieve. But who would trade love? Who would trade that? No one, I don't think. If you want
No.
to be human, you have to love and be loved and accepted. And that can be hard for people too, just to accept the love.
Yeah, I remember many years ago, I got a pair of shoes, and they were graphic shoes, and it said "Love is a gamble," and I thought they were cool shoes, that's why I bought them. But they had like a blackjack handle on them, and it said "Love is a gamble." I thought it was really cute. And then when my daughter passed away, that's when I got the real meaning of that. That love is a gamble. When you bring a child into this world, when you marry someone, even being born, as you said, we automatically love our parents. It's not even a choice, and it's all a gamble, and we all but getting a dog. I mean, we get dogs knowing that they're going to die, and I
Right.
think about it, that's not rational at all.
No, and nothing's going to love you more than a dog because they love unconditionally, and you're going to lose that love. But that's and I've thought about that, and I wrote about it in that book. We still do it, because the love is so nourishing to be
Hmm.
loved and have creature love. And I think it's great to love someone who's not human, but to love almost as deeply as you love human beings,
Hmm.
to extend that love, to cross that boundary of species and find love on the other side of it. That's amazing. What a miracle that is. um you talk about the loss of a child, and my parents, I had a brother with Down syndrome who died when I was about 9. He was 12. I was the youngest, and he died under very mysterious circumstances. The police never completely solved how he died. um, but he disappeared, and his body turned up a month later.
Mm-hmm.
So at a very early age, I learned there's a couple of things I learned about grief. And, One was, it was funny, I guess I remember coming downstairs the morning after they found his body, and of course the house was just a shroud of grief. I mean, you could feel it. It was palpable, the
Sure.
grief and the mourning at this end. And I tried to be cheerful. I tried to smile and be cheerful. And my
Hmm.
sister, I love my sister, and who was always good to me, she just cut me off. And I remember, I felt guilty about that for years and years and years, that I was somehow trying to make everything better and try to like put a good face on, the death of a child with Down syndrome, no less.
Yeah.
Was, but I felt like I see my earliest, you know, um, relationship with grief in that little boy who came down the stairs that morning trying to act like everything was okay.
Sure.
And, he could make a joke about something and then being shamed for it. My sister didn't mean to shame me, but I took it as shame. I carried that shame for decades, thinking I
Mm.
thought about that all the time, that I had not grieved properly. And really I didn't, but I was just a kid trying to make it better and
Sure.
making a horrible nightmare system. But it's not my job as a 9-year-old to to make a nightmare go away,
Right.
for the family. But the second thing I learned looking back on that was that my parents' marriage survived it.
Mm.
And not just because they were devout Catholics who didn't really believe in divorce, but that doesn't really matter when you talk about the two things that break up a marriage almost for sure are, one, the birth of a child with significant disabilities, and the loss of a child, particularly that child. And my parents survived it. Their marriage, they were just as much in love and devoted to each other after that as before.
Hmm.
And what I realized years later, having fallen away from faith and wandered off from any sort of religious belief, um, one of the realizations of how wrong that was to me was that my parents' marriage survived because of their faith. That's the only thing that kept them together. They shared the faith. They
Hmm.
really believed that God protected them and loved them no matter what happened. Without that faith, their marriage never would have survived. It'd be probably a totally different person.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that as well. I want to ask you, we start off, and you talked about Norman Vincent Peale founding Guideposts. And I know, he's most famous, or not most famous, but for me anyway, for his book, The Power of Positive Thinking.
Sure.
Um, and I think sometimes people think, well, if I believe in this power of positive thinking, nothing bad will happen to me. And we've
Oh,
talked about
yeah.
we've talked about the tragedy that befalls all of us. So how do people that ascribe to that philosophy, how do we reconcile that with all the pain in the world?
Well, one thing I'll tell you a little bit more about Dr. Peale, and this is something I learned about him. I didn't know much about Dr. Peale when I came to work at Guidepost, and I actually got to know him. But he was a man who suffered from crippling anxiety, crippling self-doubt and
Hmm.
insecurities.
Hmm.
And when he eventually went to seminary, his advisor at seminary basically told him to leave. Said, "Look, you're a scared mouse. You act like a scared mouse. You're never going to reach people and touch them and lift them up. You're never going to do that because you don't have any confidence at all." And
Wow.
so that's really put him in this path. He was like a scientist who discovered what he thought was a cure, which was
Okay.
positive thinking. Tell myself that I deserve the best. God wants me to have the best. I have to learn to chase that. And he tried it out on himself. And he found himself becoming this great orator. And he's the best public speaker I ever saw in the pulpit or in a podium in front of a convention of business people. He was the best speaker. And it was hard to believe that he had suffered such insecurity as a younger man. Um, so that was his, and Peale he went through the Depression, World War II, a lot of upheaval in
Hmm.
society. And he thought positive thinking was the way to overcome the darkness of the world,
Hmm.
not in some Pollyannish way that's disconnected from reality, but to realize, you were put on earth with the prospect of having a good life, the prospect of having a good life. But you had to go and get it. You had to believe that you could be happy and make a good life for yourself. That so many people didn't think they could be happy. And his, and in the American sort of history of faith, I mean, you had the Catholic Church, which was a big believer in original sin and the fall of man, and you had the Protestant puritanical part of the American character, which was that that we are made up of base instincts that have to be overcome all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Start burning people at the stake, or we'll get burned at the stake. I mean, it was the American religious character was pretty dark, and I think Dr. Peale thought that God did not necessarily see us. I mean, he knew we were sinful, but he didn't hate us for being sinful.
Mm-hmm.
And Peale always said, God loves you. Never forget that.
Mm-hmm.
That's the relationship you have with God, that he loves you. And if you can find that love and internalize it, you can do good things. You can overcome incredible problems. But he believed you overcame those problems with thinking that you could, that giving yourself that confidence, and that confidence derived from God's love for you, not from some, superhuman quality that you may have, but it's an extra human quality, which was God's love. You could draw on to overcome the darkness of the world. The world is always going to be in light and dark. I think of, the earth day and night, the earth rotating and the sunlight, that's sort of the way that we are made and the world is made, that it goes from light to darkness to light to darkness. It's a duality that we'll never understand. Theologians and philosophers have tried to understand that why in a world that has so much beauty, there is so much darkness and evil. And that is not a question that is there for us to know the answer. That duality is just who the world is, and sometimes who we are too. And that we can, I can be a really rotten person. I have been, and I understand that that's something for to overcome. And I think most of us gone from doing really good things to sometimes doing not so good things. And that's part of being human. And again, it does get back to surrendering to our humanness and to accepting that we can be better people. And the reason why we can be better people is because we're not perfect to begin with. So there's always a road for improvement.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm glad I asked the question. I think that's a great way to kind of wrap up what we're talking about here today, because it's really about how we come at the things that happen to us. It's not that if we think positive things that nothing, quote, bad will happen, but it's like, first of all, questioning, is this really bad? What good might come of this? What growth could come of this? And of every incident that we look back through our lives, if we really think about it, we can probably find some way that we grew from it, some way that we actually benefited from a thing.
I know. I think that's true. And that's what Dr. Peale would say, was that when you're faced with a difficult or even a bad situation, where's the good in there? Where can you chisel out that good and then grow it? There's always hope. I mean, hope is, I always thought Guidepost was kind of a hope merchant. The magazine, people read the stories and they say, they give me hope, because I read about how someone was in a really tough situation and got through it and was bettered by it. Nobody wants to say that their suffering is necessary to be a better person, but it happens very much that way sometimes. It happened for me.
Yeah.
From my suffering came a lot of positive growth that I never expected, and I dare not take any real credit for.
Well, I think we do have a choice, though. We do have a choice. We can sit down and give up when these things happen to us. We can choose to become bitter about them. So I think there is, it's funny. I was hearing someone the other day. They said, well, it's not me doing it; it's God doing it, through me, and that gets into who's God and who am I, because I think we're all one, and we are all parts of God. But yeah, we do have a choice, and I think that. And that's part of the joy of overcoming. As people, we seek out challenges. Read an article the other day about a guy who was climbing Mount Everest and came across somebody else, and he had to stop and come down. And he saved this guy's life. And you're like, well, why would you climb Mount Everest? because that's who people are. We like challenges. We like to overcome because we want to be able to get to the top no matter how tough it is. And you've shared with us today example after example of how you've overcome these difficulties in your life, and it's made you into the person that you are today. So I want to thank you very much for being here and for being so open and vulnerable, and remind people of the name of your book. And if people can reach out to you, how can they find you?
All right. So I will tell you that the book is a journey of faith, a mother's Alzheimer's, a son's love, and his search for answers. And that part of it, we didn't talk so much about answers because it's not really germane to our discussion today. But I have gone into like neurological studies now, and to find out if some of the lapses I see in my own memory as I get older are indicative of Alzheimer's. And it's the question. The world's probably divided between people who want to know and people who don't want to know.
Sure.
And I've decided wanting to know is part of my being human. And so I'm on a search and a quest to find out, like, am I looking at a future that may include dementia, the same dementia that killed my mother?
Mm.
And how would I feel about that? And what would I do? I don't know, but I'm on that journey. In the book, I talk about some of the neurological studies and the testing, the CAT scans and the MRIs that I've gone through,
Mhm.
and what I found out. So
Okay, great.
that's part of the book too. That's part of the book too. You can get A Journey of Faith at shopguideposts.org, and that's shopguideposts.org.
Mhm.
Or you can, the easy thing, just go on Amazon. If you get it from Guidepost, shopguidepost.org, you get a couple free gifts, including, access to some videos of me talking, if you
Nice.
haven't already sick of me, and you get a little booklet of my devotionals. I do write devotions for the company. And we have something called Devoutly, which is a new digital product that we've launched. And you might look in that, it's devoutly.org. And it's daily affirmations and stories and things that will make you feel positive, that will give you that positive energy, that
Mhm.
positive spiritual energy that is a great way to start the day. So that's devoutly.org.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This has been
Hey,
really,
Brian, thank you.
yeah, I want to say this is kind of personal for me because I've gone through this with my father-in-law. I'm going through it with my mother-in-law right now, and I've had two great conversations today with people who have been through this with their parents. This is something that we're all it's going to touch us one way or the other, whether it's ourselves or our parents or
Absolutely.
somebody that we know.
I know. It's funny. It's the number one fear of health fear of people over the age of 50. The number one. Cancer, heart disease, they kill more. COVID still kills more, but
Mm.
it's the number one fear we have. We fear that loss of self. And it's, if you go all the way back to people in their 20s in surveys, it's their third biggest fear, health fear, in their
Mhm.
20s. So the specter of losing ourself is is really frightening for a lot of people, but it's something to be, thought about, I guess,
Yeah.
and hoped for a cure.
All right. Well, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Brian. It's been great talking to you, really. It's terrific. Thank you.